In a world full of movie musicals and paint-by-numbers biopics comes a podcast ready to discuss and make sense of them all. This summer, prepare yourself for the History on Film podcast, epic special presentation. Musical May.
Fight in America. Life is alright in America. If you're all white in America.
If it's not in frame, it doesn't exist.
I am big. It's the picture that got small.
What's that noise?
Popcorn.
You making popcorn?
Uh-huh.
I only eat popcorn at the movies.
Well, I'm getting ready to watch a video.
Really? What?
Oh, just some scary movie.
You like scary movies?
Uh-huh.
Really? Worst film you ever saw? Well, my next one will be better. Hello? Hello?
You want to see it again?
Can we?
And just like the movies, we play out our last scene.
You are listening to the History on Film podcast. And now here are your hosts, Ross Lennon and Ryan Barr.
Hello, and welcome to welcome to the first Musical May edition of the History on Film podcast. I'm your host, Ross Lennon. I'm joined, as always, by my close friend and colleague, Ryan Barr. How you doing, Ryan?
I'm great. I'm glad we finally made it to Musical May. This is one of those things, like we've been talking about this the slate of episodes for this month for a while now, and I know we've slotted different ones in and out, but I think we have a pretty good slate for this year, and we're already talking about next year, which I'm hoping this is, I hope we get the kind of reaction, the kind of response we want out of these episodes, because otherwise we're planning for next year. That's not going to happen because people are going to be like, I don't want people to get on Blue Sky or sending us emails like, Musical May is the dumbest thing you've ever done, because we've done some dumb things on this show. We'll continue to do dumb things on this show, and that's okay. But I don't want people like, I don't want to hear about musicals. I want to hear about, Dostoevsky or, I don't know how pretentious our audience is. So.
Well, and, we talked a little bit about it in office hours, but just the idea that when one of us has an idea and pitches it to the other, there is very little resistance in either direction in terms of, like getting the other on board. So this was your idea, and I committed instantly. And the idea is we each pick two musicals each year to serve as sort of a historical document or a historical lens, and then we build a little lesson or a little conversation around it. It's going to differ depending on the musical, the type, and the frame and stuff like that. I picked a couple of real juicy softballs right down the middle for mine this year, and the first of which we're going to talk about today. But I think this is going to be a lot of fun.
I had a lot of fun researching these and kind of come up with the list, and kind of looking at what different directions we can take this in. Some musicals have more historical value than others, both as a musical or as the content. Like some are steeped in both, like, because they are an historical story, like a Les Mis, which we're going to do at the end of this month, or like a Miss Saigon. And then you got ones that are not historically related, like Xanadu, which we're going to do this month, but have a lot of history surrounding, like the production, the release, the reaction, the response, it becoming a cult classic type of thing. So every one of these is going to kind of have a different approach because they kind of do a different thing. I think next week our episode is on Cabaret, and Cabaret, while it is a historical musical in the sense that it kind of captures a certain moment in time in history, very specific moment in time, it also, the history of the musical itself, it's been revived a dozen times, and every time it's been revived, given the current era of what's going on, things change. So we have that approach for some musicals, just like the history of the musical itself. So we got a lot of different things going on. And today's musical, I think, is one of those where it's both historically as a musical and also deals with like a certain moment in time.
Yeah, and that's kind of the last little point I wanted to make, setting up the series, is that musicals are living documents in a sense, where it's like, so today we're talking about, as people can probably tell, we're talking about West Side Story. And so West Side Story, huge picture in 1961 when it came out, had a re-release in 2021. And obviously there are both casting changes, but also like a lot of textual changes as well. Even comparing the 1957 Broadway musical to the 1961 film adaptation, there are a lot of changes, both to the casting and to, a lot of the nature, especially of one of the main songs. There's a lot of changes to sort of shift the tone of it. And we'll talk about that later. But just that musicals year to year, production company to production company. Ooh, we should do company.
Yeah. See, this is what happens. Like we start talking about a musical, and then we're like, oh, this musical. This has been an ongoing conversation between the two of us for like 3 months now, of like every time. And that's how this, like, originally, like West Side Story was always like the lock in, like what we're going to do, and Xanadu was always the lock in. But the other two, we kept like, oh, we could do this. Oh, we could do that. Oh, let's do this. This is more relevant to now. Yeah, it's a whole. And we just had the conversation a week ago. We start talking like, oh, we should have done hair, like so.
But just to button it up, so just that there is certainly historical value in looking at how these productions, shift and mute and change over time, because there's a lot to learn about that as well. Right.
And also, and I know we'll get to the two, but this, from a movie adaptation of musicals, it sits in a very important point in time, because this is when they start changing a lot and Hollywood starts adapting it. So that's a whole other, and that's a whole other aspect we'll discuss throughout the series, is how some of these musicals are adapted, because going from stage to screen is sometimes some big changes are made, from musical numbers being added, changed, or whatever. And we even see this in the reverse, where things are written as a movie. I think the Disney animated movies from the 80s and 90s are a good example of this, where they're a 90-minute animated musical, but then they get the stage production, and that has to be like a 2.5 hour Broadway production, and you have subplots and songs that were originally cut, scenes that were originally cut from the original script added. We see that with Aladdin and stuff like that. So yeah, just from the adaptation, there's a lot of history involved just with an adaptation, and this is one of those great examples of major changes, from 57 to 61, and then of course it had revivals on Broadway, where, and this is another thing that happens, Cabaret did this, where changes are made in the movie, where songs are added and deleted, and then that gets updated, so the next time it's on Broadway on stage or revival, songs are replaced. So there's a lot of history in musicals and different aspects of it, and this is a great example of kind of contains the multitude of everything we're going to be talking about throughout this series. West Side Story definitely fits right in a big Venn diagram. There's like 6 or 7 concentric circles in this Venn diagram, but it sits squarely in the middle.
When you're a jet all the way from your first cigarette to your last dying day. When you're a jet, let them do what they can. You've got brothers around, you're a family man. You're never alone, you're never disconnected. You're home with your own. Company's expected, you're well protected. Then you are set with a capital J, which you'll never forget till they cart you away. When you're a jet, you stay a jet.
So today's episode, as we mentioned, is about West Side Story. This is one of the ones I picked. This is actually the first one I picked.
Yeah.
And for this one, I don't want to do too much of a plot beat by beat, as we will with some of the other ones like Cabaret. It is Romeo and Juliet, but set in a modern kind of setting. I think pretty much everybody knows the plot of Romeo and Juliet. Boy meets girl, boy accidentally kills girl's brother in a gang war, and then girl watches boy get shot. Is sort of the modified formula for this one. But
it's a classic story.
It is. But at the same time, it is this really excellent story about New York in the 1950s. The film comes out in 61, but of course there's production time, and it's based on a 1957 musical. And, as someone who studies the 1950s, for my scholarly work, 1961 is much more like the 50s than it is 1969. So what I call the long 1950s, I peg from like 1947, 1948 to 1963, roughly.
That sounds about right.
That's my 1950s, but
no, that sounds about right.
Yeah,
because technically the 60s didn't start until 64 when the Beatles came to America.
But so just to give you a little bit more of a setup. So West Side Story is the story of two gangs in the Upper East Side of New York. It's a Puerto Rican gang called the Sharks, and then a white, I guess they're not really Italian, but just sort of a broadly like a white gang called the Jets. And this is the last time that anybody is ever intimidated by the New York Jets.
Yeah.
And so the former leader of the Jets is a guy named Tony, who falls in love with a girl who has just moved here from Puerto Rico. She's in an arranged, marriage proposal, but they meet at a school dance and fall in love, and her name is Maria. And basically it's, they're on two sides of this gang war, but they're in love, and sort of they're trying to bridge, this gap that exists between the two sides of the gang, destroys them, but their love, perseveres. And then, spoiler alert, they do not survive to the end together. They don't live happily ever after.
Right. Again, if you read Romeo and Juliet or all its various adaptations, I mean, this is not the first time Romeo and Juliet's adapted, and this won't be the last time it's been adapted.
Not even the last time West Side Story will be adapted. So, but so that's that's sort of the broad strokes of it. But I want to talk a little bit about sort of what the film industry looks like at this point, because Ryan, you mentioned it a little bit before. So West Side Story is the highest grossing film of 1961. It also won 10 Oscars, including Best Picture, Best Director, Best Supporting Actor for George Chakiris, who plays Bernardo, and Best Actress for Rita Moreno, who plays Anita. And at this time in film history, so we talk about the 1950s in America. We call it the decade of television. The television basically comes around, the technology is first sort of put together late 30s, early 40s. But the television is not publicly available until 1947, 1948 is the first time that anybody can buy a TV, but they are expensive, and there aren't, most places don't have any TV networks to begin with. So it's like a very niche sort of, what we think of like as a high-end electronic purchase today. So it's like not everybody is rushing out to get one because they're expensive, and a lot of places it's like, what are you going to watch? There's nothing on. But by 1950, the television explodes in popularity, and from 1950 to 1960, it is just millions of TVs being sold every year, to the point that, and this is happening alongside Americans moving from living in big cities. This is the decade of people moving to the suburbs, the highways are being built. And so you have people spreading out, moving away from, living in the big cities for the most part. I mean, a lot of people, and, predominantly what are becoming like white and middle class people are moving out of the cities into the suburbs.
I was just about to say, this is when they start seeing like white flight, as people
yeah.
call it. Yeah.
And so the automobiles are, becoming much more popular. Interstate highways are becoming much more, accessible, and people are staying home and watching TV. And most of the movie theaters at that time were in downtowns. And we didn't have the big megaplexes like most people today are probably used to seeing, your local movie theater might have 10 or 12 humongous screens in it. A lot of movie theaters were one, maybe two screens somewhere downtown, and they would change the movie every couple of days, every couple of weeks. And so the theaters suddenly have very few people wanting to drive all the way into town just to see a movie when they can watch TV at home. And so one of the ways that the industry adapted was to do more spectacle. So what are the things that we can do on film that we can't do on TV? You have that huge screen. So we see a return to a lot of like the huge Bible epics,
The
Ben
big
Hur,
historical,
sword and sandal kinds of things, musicals,
Cleopatra,
yeah. So like just this sort of stuff of like, well, what can we do with this huge screen? You see a lot of, as I talked about briefly with Paul Klein in that episode, people are doing like a lot of stunts where they'll have like smell-o-vision or 3D. You see a lot of this comes out of the theaters being desperate to get people back into the theaters. And then the only demographic throughout the 1950s that's going to the movie theaters with any regularity is teenagers. The 1950s is also the decade of the American teenager becoming this sort of consumer identity. Prior to this, obviously teenagers existed, but not in the way that we think of them now. It was more that they were treated as young adults. A lot of them would start work very early, start working, not finish school. And so you kind of went from being like a kid to a young adult to an adult, and you didn't have this sort of conception of the teenager that we think of now.
Right. I guess that's why baby boomers think they invented teenagers, because
and of course this is not the baby boomers, this is like their older cousins. These are kids, and I'll get to it in a minute because it's my bread and butter, but it's like these are kids born during the Great Depression, growing up as kids during World War II, and now being presented with this humongous wave of prosperity that the country has not seen for 20 plus years.
Right.
But so, as I mentioned, teenagers are going to the movies. Teenagers are the new popular thing, and they have all this kinds of disposable income. And so you see a lot of marketing moving towards teenagers, both in theaters and just across popular culture, because they have money to spend and they don't have the sense on what to spend it on. But so you see a lot of films orient around this teenage audience, especially in the second half of the 1950s. So as teenagers start going to the theaters in the 1950s, you start seeing a lot of movies made about the teenage experience, and then a lot of movies like sort of focused on social issues surrounding teenagers. And in the 1950s, we get this focus on juvenile delinquency in society. Obviously, juvenile crime is not anything new, but the tone and tenor that it takes in this period is different than what we've seen, certainly in the last couple of decades in the United States. Juvenile crime during the Great Depression, a lot of it was centered around things like hunger and just food and material insecurity. So to tie with Les Mis, if you steal a loaf of bread to feed your family, are you a criminal? we'll pose that question at the end of the month. But that was a lot of juvenile crime in the Great Depression, was just trying to scavenge and scrounge, to help support you and your family. In World
Right.
War II, you still had a lot of that because, of course, we're still rationing.
hmm
But then you also see like a lot of boys lying to join the military early in order to get military benefits for their families. And you see a lot of girls who live near military bases sort of trying to get married very early, lying about their age to get married to soldiers in order to get those family benefits right before
Right.
they deploy overseas.
Right. It was a different time.
It was a much different time.
Yeah.
There was a submarine. I read this story, I don't know, at some point, but where I think like half the people on the ship were under 18. And I always thought it'd be so cool to do like a World War II action drama, but like at least half of the cast are just people that are very obviously like 12.
Das Boot, the early years.
But so in the 1950s, we no longer have, the same kind of food insecurity and all this other kind of stuff. We have these kids now have access to cars for the first time. There's a lot of, again, not for everybody, but for a lot of people, there's disposable income for the first time in 20 plus years in this country. And more importantly, more people are going to school, like more kids are going to school, and more kids are staying in school longer. And high school is becoming a much more universal experience than it had been in previous decades and generations. So while there might have been schools in the cities that more people would have had access to, a lot of those kids would have, either dropped out to work or had been working full time. But so prior to the 1950s, basically, a lot of kids were not finishing high school to the point that it would not have rang as universal to the people watching it. So in the 1950s, there's all of these jobs, the economy is booming. And so kids are able to stay in school. More kids are going to high school, finishing high school, going to college. And so because you have that time between adolescence and working expanding, you really start to get more like teenage culture.
Right. Is this why you start seeing movies like Blackboard Jungle and like Rebel Without a Cause?
Yeah. And so so the juvenile delinquency panic is centered in this period around this idea of like, we have these kids, they have cars, they have this, free time, they have this money. For adults, the 1950s, we think about like HUAC and the second Red Scare, and adults are forced to conform socially in a lot of ways in order to, not appear as communist, to where there is this real sense of like, you have to stay within the lines. It was this push for these rigidly defined gender roles that did not exist in the 30s and 40s. It was this real push towards like anti-leftist politics, and just very much like, we want to promote this sort of idealized image. This is the early days of the Cold War. And so the idea was, you have to be the religious, family with 2.5 kids, the white picket fence, the dog, blah, blah, blah. And the idea that teenagers were out of control sort of countered that idea. But so where it's like, basically, there was this sense that you have to color within the lines, because if you don't, you'll be accused of being a communist. And if your kids are causing trouble, are being either too promiscuous or, sometimes not promiscuous enough. But like, basically there was this sense that like society was becoming very strict as a way of presenting our success, of like projecting our system abroad. And
Right.
if your kids are brats and delinquents, then that undercuts that. So we talk about juvenile delinquency, and a lot of it is coded as crime. And there certainly is a lot of juvenile crime happening at this time. But a lot of it was also just deviancy being coded as criminal.
Right. We see that throughout history too, where
Yeah.
any kind of deviancy is, or perceived deviancy, I should say, because a lot
Yeah.
of it.
So like Rebel Without a Cause is a great example where it's about these three kids, Jim, played by James Dean, Plato, played by Sal Mineo, and Judy, played by Natalie Wood, who's in today's movie, of course, by the way.
Yes.
And it's, it's like these three are all kind of coded as criminals. Jim is upset because he is struggling to figure out he's trying to reconcile his idea of masculinity with sort of the emasculation of his dad and, just kind of butting up against this very tight-laced culture. Judy is sort of perceived, even though, we're told explicitly that she's not, but like is being perceived of like being too sexual and then like just sort of butting up against like this impression of her, being too promiscuous. Neither of those are crimes. And then the third one to kind of throw things off, Plato, played by Sal Mineo, is like torturing birds and animals, but is going through, and of course it's very heavily coded because it's the 1950s, but where he's struggling basically with his sexuality and he's kind of gay coded for the 1950s. But so it's like these three things that are not crimes are then defined as deviancy and delinquency. And so that is something that we see a lot in these teenage films.
Right.
And then this becomes a trend that we see basically from 1955 up until like 60, 61. I actually kind of put West Side Story as the end of this trend. And that's because once you see them all singing and dancing and, clapping and stomping, it's really kind of hard to take them as serious threats.
Right.
It kind of gives up the game.
And that's one of my biggest problems always with this musical. As much as I do enjoy this musical, is I can't, like, no one in this movie is threatening at all. I'm just like, all right, if this was scary in 1961, I want to show them like 1980s, like East New York. But it's just I can never take these kids seriously as like threats. And I get that the first time I saw West Side Story, it was like the 90s. So, I mean, I was definitely coming it from a new era. Also, by the time I think I saw West Side Story, you already had the Gap commercials where West Side Story was basically being ripped off to sell khakis, where they're doing the da-na, da-na, they're doing the whole that part in the khakis on the Gap commercial. And you're like, all right, if your gang members are being co-opted to sell khakis by the Gap, you are definitely like, the lamest freaking white dorks I've ever seen. Like that's, there also you have to sometimes suspend your disbelief a little bit.
Yeah. And
I have a hard time doing, as we've discussed repeatedly on the show.
Well, and what's interesting is because this happens after the Broadway musical is released, but before the film is released, there are a couple of high-profile juvenile delinquency cases in the United States. A lot of it, as you can imagine, is like kind of small-scale stuff. And so it's just like there's this impression that there are these local crimes happening all over the country. But in 1958 in New York, there was what was called the Cape Man killings. And this was actually made into a Broadway musical in the 80s. So we might add this to the list someday too.
This list is getting long. We might have to spin off a whole other like podcast just for musical.
But there was this kid at the time. His name was Salvador Agron, and he was a Puerto Rican gang member who murdered two other boys in a park in New York. And it's because he thought they were from a rival gang, but they just turned out to be two other boys. not that it was okay to kill the rival gang members, but these were two, innocent victims
Right.
that were not affiliated with this gang war.
I believe legally that's like innocent bystander, technically speaking. Yeah. That's. I'm not going to make any jokes as people.
Yeah. So this, as this happened, it became this national story. New York, he was sentenced to death row at age 16. He was the youngest person in New York history to be sentenced to death row. It was eventually commuted, and he was released from prison in the 70s. And, he turned his life around, but he died right before he turned 43. So he died very young of pneumonia and health issues. But just as it happened, this was a huge case, and it really spoke to like the propensity for gang violence in parts of New York. And so it was certainly something that people were aware of, by the time that this film came out. So the song that I think is my favorite from this is the song G Officer Krupke. And what's interesting about this is that it lays out so much of the societal response to juvenile delinquency in this era, how it was treated as a social issue, how it was treated as like a mental health issue, how it was reflective of instability at home, how it was reflected of, parents who were not living up to this very rigid sort of cultural ideal that, quite frankly, nobody fit into at the time, and it sort of presents all the different competing ideas of why is this happening? What's it about? And then lands on the conclusion that, hey, these kids, are trying their best. Obviously these kids are delinquents, this is a violent film, but,
Right.
it does kind of land on like, the state is not innocent in this, like the system is eliding a lot of its responsibilities and, just sort of pinning the blame back on Officer Krupke.
Right. And I mean, and not to get too much into political theory, but the state does usually have the monopoly on violence. And I think that's kind of indicative of with the song. So while this is your favorite, like one of your favorite songs, this is probably like my least favorite song from the movie.
Wow.
I know.
This song is my master's thesis.
Right.
For those who are not aware. So it's like this.
Right. So I get that part. Right. And I recognize that. But I guess for me, for some reason, every time, and I don't know why my brain does this, but every time I go to watch this movie, and I've seen this movie, at least a dozen times, if not more. For some reason in my head, I always remembered the police officer, the character that plays Officer Krupke in West Side Story, as the police officer that's in the Godfather Part 1. For some reason, I don't know why my brain does that. The officer that when they're in the Italian restaurant.
Yeah.
For some reason, my brain has superimposed that actor and that character from Godfather into the West Side Story, which I think because they're very similar characters and they look very similarly, I guess, the two actors. Because it's not even the same actor. It's not even the same actor or anything like that. But I think because he's like the beat cop that's also like all about like juvenile delinquency and the Godfather. And I think that's maybe where my brain makes that weird wiring. And I always think like, oh yeah, this is the guy from the God. It's not.
Yeah.
But in my mind, the Jets in West Side Story are singing to the police officer. Which I don't remember his name. I do remember he gets shot in the neck in the restaurant.
But you got to admit, at the very least, this is a showcase for Russ Tamblyn, and he is incredible. Just watching him flip and do all kinds of crazy moves.
Hey, you! Who, me, Officer Krupke? Yeah, you! Give me one good reason for not dragging you down to the station house, you punk!
Dear kindly Sergeant Krupke, you gotta understand, it's just our bringing upkey that gets us out of hand. Our mothers all are junkies, our fathers all are drunks. Golly Moses, naturally we're punks.
Gee, Officer Krupke, we're very upset. We never had the love that every child ought to get.
We ain't no delinquents, we're misunderstood. Deep down inside us there is good. There is good, there is good, there is good, there is untapped good. Like inside, the worst of us is good.
That's a touching good story.
Let me tell it to the world.
Just tell it to the judge.
Dear, kindly judge your honor, my parents treat me rough with all their marijuana. They won't give me a puff. They didn't want to have me, but somehow I was had. Leap on lizards, that's why I'm so bad.
Right, Officer Krupke, you're real square. This boy don't need a judge, he needs an analyst's care. This just his neurosis that ought to be coined. He's psychologically disturbed.
I'm disturbed.
We're disturbed, we're disturbed, we're the most disturbed, like we're psychologically disturbed.
Hey! In the opinion of Escort, this child is depraved on account he ain't had a normal home.
Hey, I'm depraved on account I'm deprived.
So take him to a head shrinker. You!
Who, me?
Oops.
My daddy beats my mommy clobbers me. My grandpa is a commie, my grandma pushes tea. My sister wears a mustache, my brother wears a dress. Goodness gracious, that's why I'm a mess.
Yes, Officer Krupke, he shouldn't be here. This boy don't need a couch, he needs a useful career. Society's played him a terrible trick. Unsociologically, he's sick.
I am sick.
We are sick, we are sick, we are sick, 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 like we're sociologically sick.
In my opinion, this child does not need to have his head shrunk at all. Juvenile delinquency is purely a social disease. Hey, I got a social disease. So take him to a social worker. Which way? That way.
Dear kindly social worker, they tell me get a job, like be a soda jerker, which means like be a slob. It's not I'm antisocial, I'm only anti-work. Glory, Oski, that's why I'm a jerk.
Yes, Officer Krupke, you've done it again. This boy don't need a job, he needs a year in the pen. It ain't just a question of misunderstood. Deep down inside him, he's no good. I'm no good.
We're no good, we're no good, we're no earthly good, like the best of us is no damn good.
The trouble is he's lazy.
The trouble is he drinks. The trouble is he's crazy.
The trouble is he stinks.
The trouble is he's growing.
The trouble is he's grown.
Krupke, we've got troubles of our own. Officer Krupke, we're down on our knees.
Cause no one wants a fella with a social disease.
Officer Krupke, what are we to do? Officer Krupke, Krup you!
Yeah, I find that interesting because, you know, we think of New York violence and horrible conditions, especially, you know, anything north of like the Upper East Side. Well, even the Upper East Side. But anyway, that's a whole episode in itself, the geography of New York and how that plays in history. But you do have this whole concept of, you know, like urban decay in the very late 60s, like 68, 69 in New York, all throughout the 70s and into the mid to late 80s. And then, you know, of course, in the mid to late 80s is when, you know, they start clamping down on crime. Then you have Giuliani in the 90s. You have like the cleaning up of Times Square and all these things, you know, where Times Square was not, you know, the Disney World of New York like it is now. It was, you know, peep shows and prostitutes for a good chunk of its history. But the way the urban decay of New York is kind of presented, especially in the 70s, is like the clock turns over to 1970, 1971, maybe. 60s die, the hippie movement dies, and then all of a sudden you have urban decay. But you've had urban decay in certain parts of New York going back to like the 20s and 30s. Like it moved around the boroughs, and you still see that happening where, you know, what were once really impoverished or crime-ridden neighborhoods are now gentrified. You know, Bed-Stuy used to be, I used to live in Bed-Stuy. And Bed-Stuy used to be a horrible neighborhood to live in. Now it's one of the nicest neighborhoods in Brooklyn to live in, but there's other areas of Brooklyn and other areas of Queens and the other boroughs which used to be really nice, and now they're the bad areas. It's cyclical, and it moves around, and you can kind of plot the history of crime and history of gang violence in New York depending on the era. Where you are in the anywhere in one of the islands is kind of where you are in time. But I always find that interesting, where especially with like 70s, especially 70s sci-fi, you have this urban decay of New York, especially Harlem and Washington Heights, northern part of the island going into the Bronx. And that wasn't a unique thing to the 70s or even the 80s. Granted, the 80s was more down to meatpacking. And I know I'm getting in the weeds of my New York geography here. This is something I always find fascinating. But you had it going on, and I think like you said, the Capeman trial in '58 and other movies and other things talking about juvenile delinquency, especially in New York. The whole urban decay, crime in New York has always kind of been there. I mean, and we're talking about the 20th century. Let's not even talk about the 18th or 19th century, where things get even weirder for different reasons. So I always find that fascinating, like when we talk about these things, and you can see, no, it wasn't just a 1975 urban decay riots or whatever was going on in New York and different parts of the city, but no, you had similar issues maybe in a different part of the island in 58 or 48 or 38 or 28, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, well, and I want to move from one island to another, because at the heart of this film is also the history of Puerto Rico.
Indeed.
And so, as I mentioned, one of the gangs is Puerto Rican. There was a lot of anti-Puerto Rican discrimination in New York in the 1950s. And basically, start from the beginning. The United States gets Puerto Rico from Spain at the end of the Spanish-American War, and It becomes a U.S. territory. And basically, the way the U.S. treated a lot of the Caribbean and our neighbors to the south is we moved in and we turned it into this gigantic sugar plantation.
Right.
And it was basically just U.S. agricultural interests. We made the island into one huge sugar field, basically, to satisfy demands on the mainland. Which is not good for the economy. It wasn't good for the people. It wasn't good for the local economy. Right. It wasn't good for the people. And in 1948, Puerto Rico is finally allowed to elect their own governor, and they elect a man named Luis Muñoz Marin, and he campaigns on getting Commonwealth status rather than colony status. And sort of the reason why this goes through is now the U.S. doesn't have to answer to the UN in terms of, after World War II, countries are saying like, oh, we're not really supposed to have colonies anymore. And there was a lot of like, hey, are you hitting these guidelines to get rid of your colonies? So we make Puerto Rico a Commonwealth. I think at this point, it needs to be a state. I think it should have been a state a long time ago.
I actually have an idea for that.
Okay.
Combine North and South Dakota. You don't need two Dakotas. No. That's two Dakotas too many. Combine North and South Dakota. Make Puerto Rico a state. We don't have to change the flag. We don't have to change the Senate seat, the Senate composite of 50 seats. We keep everything at a nice even 50, 100 number, so we don't have to change any laws or change any rules. We don't need. What even happens in North and South Dakota? Like, what even happens there?
Mount Rushmore.
Mount Rushmore, and they gave us Christie Nome. Like, we don't need two Dakotas. Like, one Dakota is enough. I personally think two Carolinas is too many, but being a Southerner, knowing people from both states, you talk to a North or South Carolinian, and they have different opinions on that. But again, you don't need two Carolinas. Combine those two.
I mean, and there are some differences in barbecue. So it's like I can see that. I'm not being
and there's differences in the culture and the history. South Carolina is much more coastal, much more low country, has that Delta Southern coastal vibe, which I love. I love Charleston. You also in South Carolina have like the Gullah people, and you have some different like other like smaller culture, smaller enclaves of culture. North Carolina is much more inland. It's much more hilly, and it's just more Appalachian in their culture, although they do have a slight coastal area, the Outer Banks, and that's beautiful. I can see why culturally, historically, they're distinct states, but the Dakotas, no, combine those two.
Yeah.
One Dakota is enough.
If anything, the Carolinas just need to pick 2 new names.
Yeah.
Because if they had different names, we wouldn't be having this conversation.
Exactly. Like even like Virginia, West Virginia, they're different enough.
Yeah.
That we get it. Like, okay, fine. But you don't need a North and South Dakota. North and South Carolina, fine. You can have it. As a Georgian, I have my disagreements with all the Carolinas and parts of Tennessee. And yes, I'm going to probably get some hate mail for that, as we normally do, because I hold very controversial opinions about the different status of different southern states.
Let's put it this way. Puerto Rico needs to be a state before we ever talk about Canada becoming a state.
Yeah, no. First of all, I have, and you and I both have a very unique relationship with Puerto Rico. Growing up in Central Florida, where our area was the predominant minority group was Puerto Rican. So, I grew up around Puerto Ricans. There's a lot of overlap, being you and I both being Italian on our mom's side. There's some overlap with like Puerto Rican Italian culture in certain ways. I had a lot of friends who were Puerto Rican growing up. It was uncommon during Puerto Rican holidays, things like that. You see like, parades and things like that, festivals. So me always being around Puerto Rican culture, and to some degree Cuban culture and Jamaican culture and some of the other groups that we had in our part of Florida and other parts of Florida, especially again, watching West Side Story in the 90s and then knowing what I knew about Puerto Rican culture, one, I always like sided with the Puerto Rican side of the story, number one. But number two, I also would watch this movie. I'm like, what's the big deal? Puerto Ricans are awesome. Like, have you been, like, the music's great, the food's great. Like, you get invited to a Puerto Rican barbecue, like, you're going to have a great time. Like, what's the problem, y'all? But again, I'm looking at this from a different perspective and from a different era.
Well, and so, but the reason why we have so many Puerto Rican, I don't want to say migrants, but like Puerto Ricans moving to the mainland United States is from this period in the 1950s, basically.
Right.
Once they get Commonwealth status, it's much easier to relocate, to the mainland. And the governor Marine works with the United States to create what is called Operation Bootstrap. And that is this plan to diversify the Puerto Rican economy away from just sugar into manufacturing, pharmaceuticals, basically all the kinds of things that it'll take to make Puerto Rico more industrialized, more economically vibrant.
Right.
Beginning in World War I, because we have trade blockades, or we stopped trading with the Germans and a lot of European countries in World War I, textiles and sewing became very important in Puerto Rico. And so you had a lot of seamstresses in Puerto Rico. And so that is one of the industries that is built up prior to Operation Bootstrap. And so in New York, in like a lot of the garment districts, they hired a ton of Puerto Rican seamstresses. So that was a job that women could come from Puerto Rico and do. And that was something that was very in demand, and that they had this, background of doing, and a couple generations of women being like, oh, I do this, my mom does it too, stuff like that. And that's why in the film, Maria and Anita are working at a bridal shop.
Right.
So it's like, it's speaking to a lot of these Puerto Rican girls and women are coming from the island to New York to work doing sewing and, clothes making and stuff like that. But we call this period in the 1950s the Great Migration. And just as, as you hear throughout the entire history of New York, you have large groups of people moving to the city. They face a lot of discrimination from the people that are living there. And so they form these kinds of ethnic enclaves. And so that's what you have happen. And one of the things that happens is people, create little street gangs. And so that's sort of the story of the sharks in this film.
Right.
You get a term that starts popping up this time, and it's New Yorkans. And that is a term, it's like a combination of New York and Puerto Rico. And it is Puerto Ricans who have, assimilated into American popular culture. And that is laid out perfectly in the song America in the film.
Right. And my favorite song.
I love it. It's like I've been listening to it, getting ready for this. It's driven by Rita Moreno, who, of course, wins the Oscar. Well, her and Bernardo, who both won Oscars, for this film. No surprise. But you listen to it and you want to stomp and clap around.
Well, and Rita Moreno is just fantastic. I mean,
yeah.
And that's the other thing too. We mentioned earlier about Natalie Wood being cast as Maria, and this was definitely an era where anyone darker than white, so Puerto Rican, Italian, any kind of Spanish, native, were not being. Were usually portrayed by white people. Sometimes, and then sometimes it got even worse. Like, oh, they can play someone who is Asian. They can play a Japanese or a Chinese woman. It's like, it is problematic by today's standards, but this is very common.
Yeah.
And while we're not doing it this year, we might do it next year. That's what made the Flower Drum song so unique for a Hollywood production of a musical adaptation. It was about Asian Americans and the Asian American experience, filmed in the 1960s, and it stars all Asian Americans for the most part. And it was like a big deal. I think that was like the first, to sidebar this completely, I think that was the first all Asian American cast, and it was for the longest time until I think the Joy Luck Club, maybe. It was like, it took another 20, 30 years. And I think it took another 20, 30 years. And I think the next one was Crazy Rich Asians, if I remember my history correctly. So Hollywood still has a troubled history. While we're getting better in the modern era of casting, people who are of specific races to play certain characters, that you can't really fake it. And if you do fake it, you have to use like makeup or prosthetics, and that's problematic in and of itself. Hollywood still struggles sometimes of actually casting certain people in certain roles for certain occasions. And this movie is very indicative. West Side Story is very indicative of that. But again, it's 1961, so it is of its time, of its era. So you can't paint today's standards or today's expectations on a movie that's 50 years old.
And it's controversial now. It was controversial at the time. Rita Moreno, they even had her wear, like Natalie Wood, certainly not Puerto Rican. So a lot of the people playing Puerto Ricans were wearing brown face makeup. They even had Rita Moreno wearing makeup because they wanted her to appear darker on the camera.
Right. Well, and I was going to say, even now, Rita Moreno's still with us, and she's still, even her 90s, she's a very attractive woman, but she has very fair features. And this also goes back, and this is something that you and I and a lot of people that grew up in areas, especially Florida, where there are Puerto Ricans a lot, and people who've been to Puerto Rico don't realize there are full-blooded Puerto Ricans who are blonde-eyed, blue-eyed, blonde hair that that don't speak any English, but they're Puerto Rican. They are fully Puerto Rican, only speak Spanish, and that's the other thing this movie kind of plays into stereotypes of, oh, all Puerto Ricans, are dark skinned and brunette, and it's like, no, there's a lot of ethnic diversity on that island going back 300-400 years. And again, it's problematic and not woke for lack of a better word in 1961. It's definitely not today, but again, Hollywood, I mean, only a few years before you had John Wayne play Genghis Khan. So
right. Well, and what's interesting is because you can read reviews and, sort of people reflecting on it. The New York Tenement Museum had some really interesting stuff about this movie on their website.
Great museum. If anyone's never been, and it's in the lower East Side, you have to go to Tenement Museum.
But there were a lot of people that, sort of felt like we're just happy to be, on screen. We're just like, even if it was done this way, and of course, the people saying that don't speak for everybody, but there was a sense of like, wow, they're actually, making a film with Puerto Ricans. And, the Sharks, through a lot of it, definitely seem to be, sharper and more on the ball than the Jets.
Right.
And then I was going back and forth. I think I'm going to put a couple of songs, like a couple of full songs in each episode, or, maybe a couple of lightly edited version of songs. So I am going to play America here in a minute, but it is worth noting, as I mentioned, that, these musicals are sort of living documents. And the original stage production of West Side Story, the song America was much more like derisive towards Puerto Ricans. Like, this one is much more like, they considered it much more true to the Puerto Rican experience, and it wasn't denigrating them. Whereas a lot of people found the original version to be like, pretty insulting. This one really emphasizes that sort of contrast between people moving here and, like Anita, becoming a New York, versus a lot of the guys like Bernardo who are like, oh, well, I'm ready to go back.
Right.
And so just this very interesting sort of conflict that was, happening in Puerto Rican culture during this time. This conflict of like, well, that's where I came from, and so I'm true to it. But it's also like I am being promised, something else here. And is that possible or not?
Right. And I think it's very, in the movie version, definitely, it's very representative, I think, of, you can swap out Puerto Ricans for any other immigrant or any other group that has come to America over the last 400 years and has struggled with that, culture versus ethnicity versus ideology. How do I consider myself American, but I'm also very true to, in this case, my Puerto Rican culture, right? And I think it's very indicative of those internal arguments and those internal debates that you see across ethnic and immigrant communities, even, now to today. And, every couple of years, there's kind of a newer group that, maybe they've been here for generations, maybe they're a much newer group, but you see this happening even very recently with like Haitians and Indian Americans, and you see these cultures and these debates happening both externally, like you have people usually on the right kind of like, oh well, you have to be white or at least white passing and speak English to be considered American. And then you have within these groups these debates and these arguments. You and I are both descended of Italian immigrants, and I'm only third generation born in the United States. I think you're what, third or fourth generation, right?
Yeah.
So you and I are still very close to our immigrant roots in a lot of ways. We had contact with the generations that actually immigrated here. Other groups, they lose that contact over generations. But you see that a lot of like firstborn generation versus the ones that are born here versus the firstborn generation that's born in the United States versus those that immigrated here, and those kind of internal debates of what it means to be American and still like being Puerto Rican or still being Japanese or Italian or Indian or whatever. You see that throughout history, and you see that now to this day in different groups. And it's an important argument, I think, for these immigrant groups to have, because we are a nation of immigrants. We are, what binds us is not our religion or our language, as much as the fascist MAGA types like to say that it's our laws and our shared culture, and we're supposed to be a melting pot. We're supposed to be a nation of immigrants. And you even see these play out in very tragic ways throughout history, like with like the Japanese Americans, for example. You have a lot of the first and second born generation Japanese that, while during World War II, after Order 966 was 9066, excuse me, was ordered, and the Japanese Americans were rounded up throughout the West Coast and sent to the concentration camps here in the States. You had out of the camps, you had the first and second generation born young men who were 15, 16, 17, 18, up to their mid 20s, joining because they still believed in the country. They believed in the ideals of America, signing up to join and fight the Nazis in Europe. And you had two battalions full that were predominantly Japanese American men liberating the camps in Europe at the end of the war, while their families were still living in camps back home. You also see this in World War I. You had a lot of German propaganda was trying to get the African American soldiers to defect, saying, why are you fighting for a country where back home you're not even considered a full citizen or a man? Why are you fighting for a country? You saw that German propaganda in World War I when they dropped the leaflets on American troops. So you see this also play out in, like I said, tragic ways where, what does it mean to be an American? Can I be an American and Puerto Rican in this case, in West Side Story? And I find that fascinating, being a great grandson of immigrants, and having contact with my great grandparents. They were still alive when I was a young kid. And I think and that's why I love the song America, because it does kind of paint that picture and that internal debate that you see happen very vividly and very poignantly, and very for 1961, very aware of that struggle.
Yeah, I'm going to make a seemingly unrelated connection here, but the film My Big Fat Greek Wedding was a very popular, it was at one point, I think it was the highest grossing American comedy, but that even though it was explicitly about the Greek experience, I think in Chicago, it had this huge resonance with all of these different, I know, my family's Italian, they all loved it. These people,
my family too. It was one of my mom's favorite movies. There's a lot of overlap there between the Greeks and the Italian.
But there was a ton of like, oh, my family, came to New York from here. Oh, we came to America from here. And just, it really resonated with families who could trace back, their lineage to somewhere else. So it had this universality to it, even though it was, in many ways explicitly the Greek experience. And I think that's what makes America, the song, so great, is that it speaks to, this immigrant experience, both in the 1950s and the 1910s and the 1850s and the, 1980s.
And 2025.
Yeah.
It probably, and in my opinion, it probably is the best song.
Yeah, it's the best. It's not my favorite.
Mine too.
Once an immigrant, always an immigrant.
Hey, look, instead of a shampoo, she's been brainwashed.
Stop it.
She was given a Puerto Rico and now she's queer for Uncle Sam.
Oh, no. That's not true.
Puerto Rico, my heart's devotion. Let it sink back in the ocean. Always the hurricanes blowing, always the population growing, and the money owing, and the sunlight streaming, and the natives steaming. I like the island Manhattan.
I know you do.
Smoke on your pipe and put that in.
I like to be in America. Okay, by me in America. Everything free in America.
For a small fee in America.
Buying on credit is so nice.
One look at us and they charge twice.
I have my own washing machine.
What will you have, though, to keep clean?
Skyscrapers bloom in America. Cadillac zoom in America. Industry boom in America.
Wealth in a room in America.
Lots of new housing with more space.
Lots of doors slamming in our face.
I'll get a terrace apartment.
Better get rid of your accent.
Life can be bright in America.
If you can fight in America.
Life is alright in America.
If you're all white in America.
You are free and you have pride.
Long as you stay on your own side.
Free to be anything you choose.
Free to wear tables and shine shoes. Everywhere crime in America. Organized crime in America. Terrible time in America.
You forget I'm in America.
I think I go back to San Juan.
I know a boat you can get on. Bye-bye.
Everyone there will give big cheers.
Everyone there will have moved here.
Choreography in this film is incredible.
Right. And I think the choreography, which we allude to kind of at the beginning here, also is very much indicative of how musicals were changing at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Because this is stuck in that transition period where throughout the 40s and 50s, Hollywood, when they would do film adaptations of musicals, it was pretty much filmed like they would get the big soundstage or the big warehouse, basically perform the musical like you would on stage, but on the soundstage, and then film that. I think The King and I is a great example of that,
mm-hmm.
where
yeah,
there's not a lot of dynamic camera. It's pretty much like you're watching the stage, but in a big warehouse. And there's a lot of scenes in the West Side Story that are shot like that, and then there are scenes that are shot more like a movie. Again, they're in a transition period, Hollywood. Which later on we start seeing movie adaptations like the one we're going to talk about next week, Cabaret, which it's done like a straight movie. It's with, almost where the music and the musical numbers are ancillary to the musical that it is. And you can get, because they did different things with it. But West Side Story is definitely a great example of Hollywood in a transition period where they go from things like Carousel and Hello Dolly and Camelot and The King and I, and these big, or even The Music Man, which came out not too long before West Side Story. Music Man also tries to start playing with the camera and the camera tricks a little bit, and doing different things. West Side Story doesn't get as fancy with it, right? It doesn't get so artsy with it, so to speak. But I mean, America, Officer Krupke, there's a couple of scenes where it's very, definitely by today's standards, it's obvious it's a big soundstage, and because they need that room for the dancing.
Yeah, right? It's like a big, like black box kind of, like you think of like there's a lot of small theaters like the Little Black Box Theater. It's like this is the big black box,
right?
Soundstage, and it makes sense. Right. Especially like one of the first things that they figured out when they put sound to film was like, oh, we gotta, control for background noise. Like we can't just shoot outside anymore. So it makes total sense. And especially if you're going to be, trying to replicate situations where you have people doing all of this kind of stunt work, like you need, you need to control as much as possible. But yeah, from a technical perspective, this is that sort of period. And then as well, just in terms of audience appetite, this is getting to the end of the line of families want to pile in and see a musical. Cabaret, we'll talk about this more next week, but it's like Cabaret really was like, people don't want to see, these kind of sunshine, happy musicals anymore. Like they want something with some oomph to it. They want, like,
right.
We talk about like new wave filmmaking and stuff like that.
Right. Well, I mean, and Cabaret, that was only filmed 10 years later, and it might as well have been filmed on a different planet.
Yeah.
Compared to like, and of course, throughout the 60s, not just in musicals, but we have a lot of technical leaps in filmmaking throughout the 60s. Movies start borrowing from TV starts borrowing from movies. There's a lot of cross-pollination of things. This is also where you start seeing, throughout the 40s and 50s into the 60s. And I think a great movie example of that is Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. You start seeing like either you're a TV person or you're a movie person, but you're not both. Like either you act in TV or you act in movies. In the 60s and definitely in the 70s, that start changing where you're just an actor. You can do stage, you can do movie, you can do TV, right? You can do commercials. Like there's no like, you're a TV Western actor and you only do TV Westerns. That's your lane. You cannot even do a movie Western, right? And if you're a movie Western person, you can't, like Jimmy Stewart, doing all the Frank Capra Westerns in the 50s would have never, in the 60s, would have never done like a Bonanza or, something like that.
Right. And I feel like that really didn't end until, our lifetime. Like, I feel like when we were young, it was still like, well, like you could make the leap if you were George Clooney, but
right, yeah, it started changing in the 60s and 70s. It really didn't become really a thing until like the 90s.
Yeah,
but you start seeing it kind of starting. You see people trying to do that transition. Even Elizabeth Berkley tried that transition and it did not work for her. As much as I don't think that movie Showgirls is as bad as people say it is, I unironically love that movie. But yeah, again, I love West Side Story. Again, like we mentioned at the beginning, you look at it just from in a historical context, like not just like what the story is about. It's an adaptation of Romeo and Juliet. It's an adaptation of a Broadway musical. It's discussing the Puerto Rican immigrant experience in the United States. Blah 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 blah. Looking at just from in what it is from a technical historical thing, it sits in a very nice transition period, and you can see where even 2-3 years later, we have Bye Bye Birdie, which again, Bye Bye Birdie, while it is very steeped in 50s culture in a lot of ways, it's much more cynical about the music industry. Bye Bye Birdie is a great musical, and the movie version, it's Anne Margaret. You can never go wrong with Anne Margaret. But again, just like Cabaret, 10 years later, might as well have been filmed on a different planet. Even Bye Bye Birdie going from 61 to 64, which I believe the musical, I think it was on stage in the late 50s around the same time as West Side Story. I think they were kind of contemporary on Broadway. Again, Bye Bye Birdie's film adaptation, again, might as well have been filmed 30 years later. The way that whole opening with Anne Margaret, on the treadmill type of thing with the camera movement and everything, that was totally different for a musical adaptation compared to like West Side Story, where again, there's a lot of scenes which is just a static camera, no camera movement, just trying to capture all of that stage production because of the dancing, the choreography. And again, you see that in a lot of other musicals in the 40s and 50s. The MGM musicals more than all of the major Hollywood studios in the 40s, 50s, 60s were doing musicals, but MGM was kind of the musical studio in a lot of ways. That brought you like Hello Dolly and Music Man, a lot of the big King and I, a lot of the big musicals that we kind of think of like Hollywood sound music, right? These classic Hollywood musical adaptations were brought to you by Metro Goldwyn Mayer. So
we're gonna play around with the format of these as we go along. This is our first musical May.
Right.
I have a feeling we'll probably, call back to this episode in the next ones that we're doing as well.
Right.
Because I feel like we've talked about.
There's a reason we're doing these in order, for a lot of reasons.
I want to talk a little bit about sort of some of the differences between the remake and the 61 version. I think obviously there are some things that are great. Casting more Puerto Ricans as Puerto Ricans is, something that's great. I think at the end of the day, I think the reason why I like the 61 version more is that it was so much of its time, whereas the remake felt like a period piece, where it was
Right.
people doing a really high-end production of West Side Story versus something that, even though these people are actors and, performers, it's like it was the world that they were inhabiting. And I think
Right.
that gave it, a bit more, I guess, urgency. And then there are a couple of things like Disney removed the word commie. My grandpa is a commie, my grandma pushes tea, meaning, my grandfather is a communist and my grandmother is a drug dealer. And
Right.
that's why I'm so messed up. But so it's like, that line was not unheard of at the time. Obviously, the idea that, you leftist politics would be a reason for someone to be a threat to the social order is something that is very resonant in the 50s and 60s. There were a lot of communists living in the United States. We had just won a war alongside the Soviets. And there was, all kinds of people in unions and lots of, there were lots of socialist parties throughout the country. So it's like
Oppenheimer just got railroaded in Congress. Yeah.
So it's like, it's weird that I don't know why Disney took that out. That's just one of my little bugaboos.
By this time, by 61, the Rosenbergs were already executed, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, if anything, it would make more sense for them not to say it the first time.
Right, right. Well, and we kind of alluded to this too. By the 50s, definitely throughout the 60s, I think the next musical that we talk about is very indicative of this. But also you see stuff that came a little bit later, which is talking about the same era, like Grease. Hair was another great example of like came out a little bit later.
I already picked Hair for next year.
I know you did. By the 60s, you also Broadway was trying to kind of do like what movies and TV, but Broadway was losing out to TV just as much as Hollywood was in some ways. And musicals are always a little bit more avant-garde. You can be a little more avant-garde, especially if you're off Broadway. Even in the 50s, Broadway had to be a little bit more middle America friendly in some ways. But by the 60s, you had Broadway shows like we'll talk about Cabaret, which were sexy and about queer people and about hippies and had nudity and stuff. Musicals were a little bit more hip, a little bit more of the era, a little more salacious even, and I mean, Rocky Horror Picture Show is a great example of that, which came out not about 10 years later. Well, the musical came out quicker, sooner than the adaptation. And that'd be a great episode in of itself, not for Musical May, but just how that movie came about and how Fox didn't know what to do with it, which kind of a running trend for Fox up until about Star Wars in the 70s. Fox kept making movies in the 70s and they did not know what to do with them or how to promote them.
They didn't know what to do with Firefly in the 2000s.
yeah. Well, yeah. That's a whole other episode. But yeah, so I can see where musicals might have like, like West Side Story. Oh, my grandpa's a commie and my grandma is a drug pusher, because it's a little salacious, a little, type of, it's a not a leer, but it's definitely a wink,
Yeah.
And Broadway is starting to do that a lot, especially throughout the 60s and 70s. And then the 80s, we get all the Andrew Lloyd Webber rap, which is a whole, don't get me started on him.
I think the thing about the new West Side Story is that the technology, like the filmmaking craft and stuff, is all so much better. But at the end of the day, like, it just feels like watching a revival production of a musical.
Right.
I don't know. Maybe it's just me. Maybe the people who are watching it, the kids who are watching it, and don't have a lifelong relationship with the other one, feel differently. It might be one of those ones that, we have to recuse ourselves on.
Right. I'm of two minds of on the updated version of the 2021 version. On the one hand, I appreciate because of the advances in technology, and because by this point we've had so many musical adaptations. We're not stuck in the 60s anymore, where it's the big soundstage, static camera, maybe through cameras if they want to get fancy, right? But there's not a lot of that camera. Again, I think America, again, where it's the best song in the original movie, I think it's the best part of the remake, because they're able to they're not just stuck on a rooftop anymore. They kind of get to go throughout the neighborhood, and they're in the bridal shop, they're in the street, they're on the rooftop, they're dancing on taxis. It's a lot more fun in that way, because you get to kind of explore the neighborhood more. You get to explore these people's homes more. You get to kind of see the environment, and it really captures that part of New York in the 50s. So that part of it's great. I can see why they didn't update it for modern audiences, because in the sense that of the setting, I don't know if the story would work anymore if you made it set in 2025 or 2021 would have, in the 2020s or 2010s, or even set in the 90s, make it a little bit retro, right? Set in the 80s or 90s. I don't know if the story works anymore.
Yeah, kids aren't killing each other in the streets anymore. They're playing dang Fortnite.
Right. So I see why they kept it in late 50s, early 60s setting. But yeah, it does come across as a like you said, a period piece versus the original. It's contemporary, and I think that's the big difference. Whereas in 61, the story and the setting was still contemporary. By 2021, it is a retro story at that point, unless you completely drastically changed it. And the new production, they didn't want to drastically change it. They wanted to do a faithful adaptation, and they did that. And there's parts of it that work, and the parts of it that don't work. It's not like when they did, which it was not a good updated version, but when they updated Footloose, right?
Yeah.
That movie, it takes place in the 80s when it came out. It's one of those kind of timeless stories that could be kind of set at any time. And the newer movie, they set it kind of now, and it works and it doesn't work. And that's more because, you can't, Footloose is kind of a special, a lot of special sauce went into making that movie. And the updated version just didn't have that oomph. Whereas I think the recent version of West Side Story does have oomph to it. And I think what it does a great job of doing the musical, of introducing maybe a younger audience to that musical. And I do think you can watch it in companion to the 61, and you'll get different things out of it. And it's not taking away, and it's not trying to be different. It's trying to do its own thing in good ways. And whether it comes out in the wash or not is up to individual viewers. But I do think parts of it work better than the original, and parts of it don't work better than the original. And that's going to be the same way I feel about, like, the 3 different Dune adaptations. They all do something different. They're not trying to be, oh, I'm going to be the better version of this older version. No, I'm going to do my own thing,
Yeah.
The 2021 West Side Story was not trying to do, we're doing something, we're trying to be the original but better. We're like, no, we're doing our own interpretation of it. Because at the end of the day, it is an adaptation of a stage musical. It's not necessarily an adaptation of a movie. It's an adaptation of a stage musical, and they can, pick and choose, kind of like what we mentioned earlier, and we'll talk about this next week a lot. And it even is true for Les Mis a little bit. You get these revivals of Broadway musical, like West Side Story comes out, and then the movie changes things from the play, and then the next time the play is revived after the movie comes out, within the next 10, 15 years, there are things taken from the movie, because now people have more connection to the movie than they did the original play. So now, so that they know West Side Story, the movie. So, okay, we got to put those things from the movie into the new stage version. And then the stage version becomes this new hybrid of things. And then, a movie adaptation comes out later, and now people are more familiar with this newer stage version that is a hybrid of the original stage version and the movie. And now the new movie has to pull on 3 strings. And there's nothing wrong with that. I think good art should adapt and evolve and take elements from other places. Again, we see that with Cabaret. We'll see that with other musicals we talk about. where you'll see things get like remixed continually, and that's not a bad thing, and I don't think, in the grand scheme of things, it's not a bad thing.
So I have about 1,000 books, on the 1950s, film in the 1950s. This is my lane. And so narrowing film recommendation, we're just going to say watch West Side Story. Either one, or watch both and let us know which one you like better. Maybe, we'll say that. Watch them both, make your pros and cons list, and then you tell us which one you like better. But for the book recommendations, I have a few. The first one is sort of the starting point for the history of 1950s juvenile delinquency, and that's James Gilbert's A Cycle of Outrage. This is a great look at, it's not as much about film. It's much more about, real lived history. But it's an incredible book about the history of the 1950s, focusing on juvenile crime, juvenile violence. And like I said, that's, where you learn about a lot of the stuff prior to, that sort of like how this concept of delinquency changed. Another great one is a former guest of ours, Stephen Tropiano. He wrote Rebels and Chicks, A History of the Hollywood Teen Movie. We talked about how, as people move away, the movie theaters are struggling to survive. This really looks at how theaters, they fought it at first, and then sort of how they embraced like the teenager as the driving force for theater attendance. And it starts in this period, but it goes to the present day. So he talks, he goes beyond the scope of today's episode, talking about like the teen picks of the 1980s, 1990s, 2000s.
Yeah, teenagers are still driving a lot of popular culture,
especially theater attendance.
Especially theater attendance, and it's very much like the Simpsons. Grandpa Simpson, I used to be with it, and then they change what it is, and it'll happen to you.
You make me feel like dancing! I want to dance the night away!
What the hell are you two doing?
It's called rocking out.
You wouldn't understand, Dad. You're not with it. I used to be with it, but then they changed what it was. Now what I'm with isn't it, and what's it seems weird and scary to me. It'll happen to you.
No way, man. We're gonna keep on rocking forever. 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 Forever.
And so the last one, this is, another broader look at the 1950s. This is Elaine Tyler May's Homeward Bound. This is American families in the Cold War era. When I talk about sort of the social structure of the 1950s, we use this term called like containment culture. And, Elaine Tyler May's book is sort of the text on containment culture. Historians, when they pick their field of study, they'll find a couple of books and they'll carry them with them wherever they go. This is one of the ones, for me. It covers everything from gender, marriage, all the different realms of culture in this period, and sort of the effect that the Cold War had on opportunities for men and women. There's some great stuff about bunkers, like bomb shelters. It opens up talking about a newly married husband and wife who I think had their honeymoon inside a bomb shelter. So
that's romantic.
It's just, it's a really interesting book. It's, like I said, it's one of those ones that's been reprinted quite a few times. So that's always a good sign, we say.
So when you say Homeward Bound, it's not the Disney movie of the two dogs and the cat? Okay.
No, and crucially not based on that either. So,
oh, man. How great is that movie, though?
That is a great movie.
Do an episode.
It's not a musical, but...
No, we should do an episode on that.
All right. Well, we've had a lot of fun with this episode. I can't wait for the rest of Musical May, both this year and beyond.
Yeah, and it's kind of came together. Like, this was just like one of those like strokes of genius moments we had. And I'm looking forward to next week. Next week, we're going to be doing Cabaret, which that has a much much more storied history than West Side Story in the sense of like that the revivals and the changes and stuff over time. And we get to talk about, kind of the Weimar Republic, which is always a good time, depending on who you are. Not really. It's a very sad part of history.
Yeah.
I mean, what came after was even worse, but there was a brief glimmer of hope, and then it got snuffed out.
And it's interesting because this is our first sort of consecutive mini-series.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, we're in the postscript phase of this episode now, but it's like I thought most of our episodes would be you and me. I thought, who in their right mind would want to talk to the two of us? We've had so many great guests. I kind of thought half of our episodes at least would be just you and me. For this year, the musical maze are just going to be the two of us.
Right.
And then I think this is also the last time where we knew, like, all right, well, here's what's coming next, where we're all on the same page about what to expect for the next few episodes. So,
right. And
it's interesting.
I mean, well, and there's also the nature of, sometimes we have a couple of episodes recorded, but we have to play with the calendar sometimes for certain things or certain reasons or whatever. And we know, like, I think our in our office hours in it was technically an office hours, but we weren't calling it that yet, in December, when we were like, oh, we have, after New Year, we have these episodes coming up. Some of them were already recorded, some we were scheduled already, but we didn't know exactly when they were coming out, like the Godzilla episode with Bill Susui or something like that. We knew it was coming. It was in the works, and it was, like I said, it was scheduled, but we hadn't recorded it yet. And so sometimes we know things are on the horizon, but this is the first time we were like, no, we're doing these 4 in a row. We're going to try to record them in order. Even if we don't, we know what's coming up, so we can say, oh yeah, next week we're doing Les Mis, even we are recorded or whatever.
And maybe I'll feel better once we get a couple of these under our belt. I've been writing about this in some form or another for about 3 years now. So it's like, I don't know if I'm just overly critical today, or if I'm trying to cram, 80-page thesis or a 300-page book into a 2-hour, shoot the breeze conversation with my buddy. So it's like,
well,
other people might be like, oh yeah, that was a good one. And I'm like, no, I missed this.
Right. Well, and the thing is, of the 4 musicals we're doing, 3, again, are talking about a very specific time in history. And that was just by coincidence that we chose these 4, because we could have done some other ones that have nothing to do with like a historical moment or historical era. And with all 3 of these cases, West Side Story, Cabaret, and Les Mis, we have to kind of put that historical context. Definitely, maybe not so much with West Side Story, because it's, remove some of the historical context of it. Oh, it's gangs in New York, kids fight, like, it's Romeo and Juliet. You can kind of wrap your head around it, even if there are historical precedents for it, like we talked about earlier. But definitely for the Cabaret and Les Mis, there's a lot of historical stuff that we got to kind of crash course everybody on for it to make sense. To understand Cabaret and its setting, you kind of have to understand like sex and queerness in the Weimar Republic, which is a very unique thing. Just like with Les Mis, because a lot of people confuse that, like, oh, they're talking about the French Revolution. Yes, but not the one you think. Because it's the June Rebellion. It's not it's not 1789. It's it's the 1830s. It was one of the later revolutions, because from 1789 all the way to pretty much 1947, there's been a long line of revolutions, counter-revolutions, and monarchical restorations in France. That the French Revolution wasn't one revolution; it was a continuous series of revolutions and revolts, and the Paris Commune and the Franco-Prussian War, and a whole bunch of things. Getting us to the modern era of France. It wasn't just, oh, they killed the king, guillotines, and then they have a republic. Yeah, they did for like an hour, and then Napoleon shows up. So we're not going to get into all of that, but you kind of have to explain what was happening in the 1810s to the 1830s for Les Mis to make sense. But to explain that, you kind of have to explain 1789 to 1801. you know. And so same thing with like Cabaret. I think a lot of people listening know the history of World War One, know the history of World War Two, and the rise of fascism and the Nazi Party in 1933. But you have a 20-year period, and the interwar period, of a lot of unique different things going on in Germany that explain, of course, the rise of the Nazi Party and fascism, but also kind of what they did, like destruction of like the Berlin Institute of Sex and things like that. That also explain Cabaret. You have to get into the weeds of the history a little bit. So the fact that we're explaining that, I don't think is a problem.
Yeah,
I don't think. And and we can always just put in the show notes, if you don't want to hear the history and just talk about, you want to talk about a musical, skip to this point, I guess.
Yeah.
As long as they download and listen, I don't care where they jump around to. Personally. And then we have Xanadu, which is just a fun, like, there's no history there. We don't have to explain anything there.
I'm excited about that one. I'm starting
me
to
too.
get psyched up for it. So
yeah.
All right. Well,
put on that ELO.
Well, thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you next week.
Yep.
What's going on? Fire alarm. That's it? Yeah, I gotta be thorough. Is that your name? Yeah. Krupke? Mm-hmm. Really? Yeah, Matt Krupke. You're Officer Krupke! I am. Familiar with West Side Story? No, sir. What? There's a character in West Side Story named Officer Krupke. Okay. You're Officer Krupke. You never heard the song? No, sir. Oh, Officer Krupke, what are we to do? Gee, Officer Krupke, Krupp you. You never heard that? No. No? No. By the way, they wanted to say fuck you, but in the 50s on Broadway, Sondheim, he couldn't write fuck you. So Krupp you is a substitute for fuck you. Has anybody ever said Krupp you? No. Huh.